Shalom, my name is Rabbi Johnny Solomon.
And my name is Rikki Ash. I am a coach and educator. I use Viktor Frankl's logo-analytic approach to help women find meaning in their lives.
And I'm what I call the virtual rabbi, and I provide online spiritual coaching, halachic consultations, and Torah study to men, women, and couples around the world. Now, we connected not so long ago, right?
Yeah, like a week ago.
So Rikki and I connected, and we realized that we both think similarly about matters to do with faith, and we both recognize the importance of helping people, and we have a shared interest in a number of thinkers, and we thought we'd do kind of an online conversation, especially as we come towards the Yamim Noraim. And
yeah, so we thought, sorry, keep going.
Please.
We thought we'd start by sharing some quotes from thinkers that we have learned from, and really just have a very candid conversation in terms of our thoughts of those quotes, and really have that kind of lead us towards a conversation about some of the main themes of the Yamim Noraim.
Right. So we've collated 4 thoughts, 2 Rikki's put together, 2 I've put together. We've seen the ones that the others put together. We haven't really kind of planned a podcast or a lecture here. Instead, this is going to be much more impromptu. One of us is going to present a quote, and the other is going to kind of comment and say how it speaks to them. And we hope each of these teachings speak to you as we come up to the High Holy Days. So we're going to begin with the first quote, and it's pretty meaningful to you, Rikki, right?
Yes, so this is actually a quote by my grandfather. It is a quote that my grandfather wrote based on teachings of Viktor Frankl. He says, "Guilt is an anathema in modern society. But what is wrong with guilt? Only if we perceive ourselves as guilty can we talk in terms of responsibility and improvement. If we are not responsible, we are not guilty. If we are not guilty, how can we improve? To be guilty is to be human. To be human is to be guilty. Why should we fight the feelings of guilt? It is preferable to incorporate guilt and the awareness of responsibility implicit in the guilt feeling, and then use the guilt as an energizer for future corrective achievement. The thrust should be away from guilt from and to guilt towards." So this is really a quote about guilt that, at least in my opinion, when I first came across it, which actually was pretty recently, it really turns the idea of guilt on its head, right? It talks about how, yes, we understand the concept in our society, like we have Jewish guilt, but in general, guilt is not a feeling or an emotion. I actually looked it up. Was it a feeling or an emotion? And apparently it's an emotion, right? Guilt is not really an emotion that we enjoy. But according to this quote, right, it actually is important, because without the feeling of guilt, then we never have the obligation to take responsibility, right? If we don't feel guilty, then we're never going to take responsibility. And so the shift shouldn't be, don't be guilty, right? The point of our lives, I guess, is not to be perfectly balanced at all times, never feel a little bit more guilty than we want to, right? Guilt can actually be productive as long as the thrust is away from guilt from and to guilt towards. Instead of saying, "Oh, I feel guilty because I, forgot my friend's birthday and she's upset with me." That's a pretty trite example, but just, to illustrate. But instead, guilt towards, okay, so how can I improve in the future? How can I be a better friend? How can I be a better spouse? How can I be a better, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, and how, I guess, it resonates in terms of Jewish literature.
Well, I love this quote when you shared this with me just a couple of days ago, because when we think of guilt, we think about this kind of anchor, right? This weight, this thing that holds us down and limits us because we feel bad about what we've done. And that's that guilt from whatever we've done. And your grandfather says, 1 second, guilt can be a springboard. It can be something which animates you to take responsibility, to mature, to recognize that there are ways in which we grow, and we all need to grow. We all can improve. We all need to improve. And rather than dismissing guilt as being something which is a bad thing, we need to harness it in a healthy way, in a constructive way, and use it to move us forward. And I think it's a really deep insight, because too often guilt has this negative connotation, and he's flipped it. And he said, actually, this is a really positive, really healthy thing if understood right.
Beautiful. Yeah. Wow. I really like that. Would you like to share some, Jewish literature on guilt?
Well, this is very Jewish. I think
Well,
it's very.
yes, that's true. It's true. It's actually not from a Jewish themed book. It's really on a book about, Viktor Frankl's concepts of logotherapy. Obviously, he's a rabbi. So, I guess that makes it Jewish, but it's really coming from a psychological perspective. So I guess that's what I meant. Sorry.
No worries.
Yeah.
So the source I quoted, and that I've collated lots of quotes of Rabbi Saks, is where he distinguishes between guilt and shame. One of his more recent comments a few years before he passed was how we've become a shame culture, whereas in fact Judaism and even Christianity were guilt cultures. And he explains the difference. He says guilt cultures conceive of morality as a voice within the voice of conscience that tells us whether or not we've done wrong. Shame cultures think of morality as an external demand, what other people expect of us. And let's pause there just before we proceed. One is internal, one is external. One is something which we conjure from within, and one is something which is directed towards us by others. To feel shame is to experience or imagine what one looks like in the sight of others who pass judgment on us. Shame cultures are other directed, as I said. Guilt cultures are inner directed. Guilt cultures make a sharp distinction between the sinner and the sin. The act may be wrong, but agent's integrity as a person remains intact. That was that famous remark of Bruria in Gemara Brachot. That is why guilt can be relieved by remorse, confession, restitution, the things we do, and the Yamim Noraim, and the resolve never to behave that way again. In guilt cultures, he says there's repentance and forgiveness. Shame is not like that. It is a stain on the sinner that cannot be fully removed. A shame culture does not provide forgiveness. And his point, Rabbi Saks' point was, when we adopt a shame culture, we lose forgiveness. And if you lose forgiveness, if you can't forgive others, then you perpetually carry a sense of shame for things you've done. You're not able to be that guilt towards that your grandfather spoke of. So it's not just there's a bad version of guilt and there's a good version of guilt, and then there's a worse, which is a thing called shame.
Wow. Yeah, that really, it got me thinking also back to that quote, right? How yes, we are bad, like our human emotions, we want to feel different feelings, but I guess in an interesting way, guilt is almost a meaningful feeling in the sense that it's productive, it leads to something, whereas it seems from this quote, shame is meaningless. It doesn't really help us, and it's something that as a society, we've sort of gotten into this culture of shame. And I think almost before we can get to that level, like you're saying, of forgiveness, and even before forgiveness is just taking responsibility, we almost need to remove the shame, because it's really not productive until we get towards, right? There's no such thing as shame towards instead of shame from. Like shame towards goes nowhere. It has to be, right? It's almost like first convert shame into guilt. And then once you got it a little bit lower down, then into responsibility and ultimately forgiveness. It's a very interesting way of looking at shame and guilt, and it's a very different way. Fascinating.
That shift that you point to, Rikki, of going from shame to guilt requires that I cease paying attention to the way others see me and instead define myself by how I see myself. And so many of us are reliant, are defined by the perception of others, and we've lost sight of how to see ourselves. That's really the tragedy of the shift from a guilt to a shame culture, that we're not really able to do a cheshbon hanefesh because we don't even know how to look at ourselves. We only know how to look at others, or we only know how others look at us. That's tragic. And without that self-reflection, we can't really harness these days the way they're meant to be. because we can't get into ourselves. Instead, we're always looking at what other people are doing. We're always thinking what other people are thinking about us.
Right. They say you're a combination of like something like the 5 people you surround yourself with the most. And I think those people could be people in your actual physical lives and also even your online communities, right? People you spend time with. And that's obviously means you should hang out with good people and good influences, but it's also scary to see that you really are a combination of like the people around you. We're so not in touch necessarily with our deepest selves. And yeah, this is the time to kind of fix that and look into ourselves as much as possible and try to, close away the noise. Wow.
That interesting. You say that close away the noise. Actually, one of my favorite quotes of Rabbi Saks is that God is a noise at all it lives, but all too often, sorry, God is a music at all it lives, but all too often we're distracted by the noise, and our task is to go beyond the noise and try and hear the music, and that requires a sense of stillness. And he actually says elsewhere, Yom Kippur is actually a very private day. A lot of the other festivals they're national days, about people coming together, the pilgrim festivals. But actually, Yom Kippur, although we commemorate the day together, it's a private day. And really, this is being affirmed here. Our task is to hear that inner voice of what we're whispering to ourselves about ourselves.
Wow. Yeah.
So we're going to take a pause for a second, and we're going to move on to another theme on forgiveness.